Close to 200,000 Americans lost their lives fighting the Nazis in World War II, and yet hundreds of those Nazis and their collaborators eventually wound up living comfortably here in the United States, becoming U.S. citizens. How did it happen? That is the story we shall tell in The Nazi Connection, a story you have never heard till now, of how highly placed U.S. officials, despite the express orders of two presidents of the United States, invited Nazi collaborators, killers, to these shores to trade what they knew about the Soviet Union for sanctuary here.
Several hundred Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe and Russia were smuggled into the United States for intelligence purposes.
Smuggled by whom?
State Department intelligence, specifically the Office of Policy Coordination. It was the first covert spy agency set up in the United States. It predated the CIA by several months.
Who is this man making these charges, and what gives him the right to say what he has just said? His name is John Loftus, and for 2 years he was a prosecutor with the Office of Special Investigations in the Department of Justice, responsible for weeding Nazis and Nazi collaborators out of the United States. His security clearance went 3 levels above top secret, but this young Irish Catholic attorney, now in private practice in Boston, has decided that his conscience demands that he bring to light what he says remained for too long, a dark and sinister top secret.
We had one unit of the government out trying to prosecute the Nazis, and other units of the government trying to secrete the information. We later established that the files pertaining to the Nazi immigration had been withheld from Congress, from the courts, from the CIA, and from the local agents of the Immigration Service.
Didn't President Roosevelt, didn't President Truman say specifically that war criminals were not to be brought into the country?
That's absolutely true.
And Jimmy Carter went even further in 1980, when he said that any Nazi war criminal who had gotten into the United States should be rooted out.
The world must never forget the lessons of the Holocaust. That is exactly the reason why, after 40 years of government inaction, I set up a special unit in the Department of Justice to root out Nazi war criminals who may be in hiding in the United States.
That was the unit John Loftus worked for, a unit that is still trying to denaturalize and or deport Nazi war criminals living in the United States. We asked Loftus who it was who had run the old OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination, that was responsible for bringing Nazi collaborators into the United States.
A man by the name of Frank Wisner. He was a former intelligence operator during World War II.
With the OSS?
That's correct. His boss was Alan Dulles in Germany.
The Office of Strategic Services, was it called?
Yes, it was.
Was there nobody in the State Department at a higher level who knew what was going on and okayed it? Did Frank Wisner have no boss?
There were 3 men who principally were Eisenhower's representative for Cold War affairs during the early 50s. C.D. Jackson, Undersecretary of H.E.W. Nelson Rockefeller, and Vice President Richard Nixon.
Would they have known that former Nazi war criminals were being employed by U.S. military intelligence and were being invited into the country, given U.S. citizenship, despite what they had done?
I read some classified information that indicated that a number of these programs were approved at the highest levels.
Whether Richard Nixon, the late Nelson Rockefeller, and the late C.D. Jackson, former publisher of Time Life, whether they knew is still an open question. But if they didn't know, then they too were being lied to, as was the case with the Congress later on. The story begins here, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Just a few months after the invasion began, the Nazis had captured huge tracts of territory that extended from the Ukraine to Byelorussia. Byelorussia was to be the Nazis' highway to Moscow. At first, the Nazis were welcomed as liberators by the people, scarred by the purges of Stalin. But that changed when the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi mobile killing squads, entered. These units recruited collaborators from among the Soviet people to massacre hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Russian collaborators with the Nazis served so faithfully and so well that the Germans made the collaborators into their own SS division known as the Belarus SS.
We're talking about the leaders of an SS division that fought against Americans and the leaders of a Nazi puppet government in Belarus that by the end of the war had exterminated 25% of their civilian population, including nearly all of the country's Jewish population, some 750,000 Jews. I decided to pick one of the regions of Belarus and see if we could find how many Nazi officials from that region were in the country. All of them were. They knew that the entire Nazi government of Belarus, the president, the vice presidents, cabinet ministers, governors, mayors, police chiefs, were all living in America. They knew that.
Who's they?
The FBI, Army counterintelligence, Army foreign intelligence, the Department of State. They knew, and they recruited them because they were Nazis.
As early as 1946, the major espionage services of the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a clandestine conflict. The demand for intelligence was so great that a seller's market sprang up. Hundreds of former Nazis and Nazi collaborators found employment in one intelligence service or another. A few of the boldest worked for both sides. According to Loftus, emigres with intimate, if dated, knowledge of Eastern Europe and former Nazi intelligence officers competed to peddle fabricated reports to any intelligence service gullible enough to buy them. And OPC was a willing buyer. But I still want to make this clear. Did U.S. military intelligence know the kind of people they were bringing in?
Beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Shortly after being apprised of what Loftus had learned, Alan Ryan, head of the office Loftus worked in, sent a top-secret report in October 1980 to then Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti, saying that this was the single most important matter his office was engaged in. That report said, quote, "It should be apparent that the matters discussed in this report are extremely sensitive, both because of the number of Belarusian Nazis who entered this country and the extent to which U.S. government agencies apparently assisted that entry, possibly in violation of the law." John Loftus also gave a set of classified documents on the matter to Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank of the House Subcommittee on Immigration. When you first heard this tale, Congressman Frank, what did you think?
I thought it couldn't possibly be true. I thought it was the kind of thing that the paranoid type people make up and really wasn't true. To think that within a year or two after discovering the death camps, that the top officials of the American government could have been working with butchers, Nazi butchers, to kind of sneak them into the country. No, I didn't believe it.
Are you convinced now the story's true?
I'm convinced it's true, yes.
What has convinced you?
The documents I've read, either someone has done, for purposes I couldn't fathom, the most massive set of forgeries in history, or the documents make it very clear.
What documents have you seen, Congressman Frank, that convinced you?
One that I have right here, which is a page on Emanuel Jashuk, who was one of the Nazi leaders in Belarus, who was guilty of the worst kinds of crimes, smuggled over here, allowed to become a citizen.
What does it say?
It says, for instance, that in approximately February 1942, he was appointed mayor of Stolce. 2 months later, he was raised to the position of the head of the district of Stolce, which he held until 1944. People should understand that he was appointed to these positions in occupied Russia by the Nazis.
By the German Nazis.
By the German Nazis, and where he was, in fact, promoted because of his good work.
What was his good work?
His good work was to help, one, murder innocent Jewish people, two, to fight the Allies.
Why was U.S. intelligence so interested in bringing these people into this country? What did these Belarusians have to offer?
They convinced OPC and military intelligence to fund their operations, that they could provide the Americans with a secret army behind the Iron Curtain. It was a tragic lie. Every one of their operations had been penetrated by the Soviets.
During the 1950s, according to Loftus, the OPC dropped Belarusians inside the Soviet Union by parachute.
The parachute teams that were sent in had an astounding fatality rate. Nearly all the paratroopers were caught and killed within minutes after they landed.
Ostensibly there to set up a network, to set up a listening post, a watching post.
Oh, there was more to it than that. The program was assassination.
These were hit teams?
That's correct. They were to start a civil war behind the Iron Curtain.
Apparently they were not very successful. On the contrary, it was a botch.
It was worse than a botch. many of the Belarusians were later identified as having been double agents. They didn't have much difficulty. The Soviets had penetrated both the British and the German intelligence services. As a matter of fact, the assistant to the German intelligence service, an ex-Nazi himself, was working for the Soviets since just after World War II. He had access to virtually every NATO document and passed them all to the Soviet Union.
That person was Heinz Felfer, who worked for West German intelligence after World War II. Felfer and Kim Philby of British intelligence helped convince the Americans of the value of the former Nazis, a group the Soviets had heavily infiltrated. It was not till several years later that it was learned Kim Philby was really a mole working for the Russians.
I read one top-secret State Department report that said that there were 22 different intelligence agencies interrogating the emigres in the displaced persons camps, all competing with each other, all fighting over for the same Nazis.
That was part of the problem. No, it wasn't just one group bringing in these Nazis. They engaged in a competition, so they began to spy on each other. We seem to have had more intelligence agencies than there were countries to spy on.
Not only were Nazis brought to the United States, but U.S. military intelligence also sent a number of them to South American countries, according to Loftus. And we have learned that at least one South American country told the United States it refused to take any more Nazis.
And I would say that as a conservative estimate, there are more than 300 Belarusian Nazis living in America today.
Still alive.
Still alive.
Still operating, American citizens.
That's correct. Some are still working for the government.
Some are working for quasi-governmental agencies like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. William Cratch is New York bureau chief and Gene Sosin head of programming for Radio Liberty. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was once funded by the CIA, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
How come?
It would have been embarrassing to admit that this was an official government function. The worst kept secret, of course, of the Cold War because the Soviets knew about it, but it was always possible to say on the diplomatic level, this is a private organization and...
Crusade for Freedom, publicly supported.
Precisely.
The Crusade for Freedom was the way most Americans learned about Radio Free Europe. Although money for it was solicited from the American people, Radio Free Europe was funded almost entirely by the CIA. Radio Free Europe broadcast the news to the Soviets and was also used to transmit secret messages behind the Iron Curtain. It would seem that the people who worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, should be people, if you will, beyond reproach. Am I wrong?
Like Caesar's wife. Right.
Did you have a man named Stanislav Stankiewicz who worked here?
Yes, he was a freelancer for a number of years with our Belarusian service.